What am I going to do? Maybe you have 6 months of savings that are going to carry you through. Or maybe you don't. I'm simply saying that this psalmist says, I've got the light, God's my salvation, and then he says, He's my stronghold. It's a military term. In Yahweh, he found confidence, peace, and safety from all who would harm him. And notice in this, neither the severity nor the numbers that the enemy represent has any effect in God's refuge. Regardless of how severe, how voracious, how ugly, and how terrible the enemy may be, I have no fear. I'm in God's refuge, God's stronghold. Regardless of how many, we are too often caught up in the circumstances and caught up in what's going on around us, instead of turning our eyes towards God and saying, I'm resting in you. You're my life, my light, my salvation, my stronghold. I'm trusting in you. So the psalmist goes on to say, and in verse 4, one thing, he says. Now, in the New King James Version, it says, one thing I have desired of the Lord. But when I looked up the word desired, it actually is more times translated asked. One thing I have asked of God. That's what I want. One thing that, and typically we tend to ask what we desire, but what does he ask for? He says that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Now, here's the thing, folks. We need to be careful lest we should spiritualize this and saying, oh, he doesn't really mean like he wants to be in the temple of the Lord. It's just like, he just kind of wants to be in the presence of God. Again, it's important for us to step back into David's time. The temple and the tabernacle was equated with the presence of God. When you left the tabernacle, you left the presence of God because God's presence was in the holiest of holies. He sat on the Ark of the Covenant. That is where the Jews believed, the Jewish priests and the Jewish religion was that God's presence was on the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, between the wings of the cherubim. And so to be in the presence, and I say that because oftentimes we forget the importance of what it means to be in a place of worship. Now, being here today in this room, when we leave this room, you know what it is? It's just a room, an empty one at that. But you have to admit that when we all gather here together, there's something about this room. It's not the same. If all there is to our gathering together is simply to have knowledge and instruction, I mean, you can read your Bible, you can listen to tapes, you can go and bring down, listen to tapes. What, did I say that? You can get an iPod, you can download MP3. Who's listened to a tape lately? Anybody? Who even has a tape player? Boy, does that date me or what? Good for you. And so we can get instructions from anywhere else. We don't have to come here for it. And when it comes to praise, when it comes to singing and worshiping God, we can worship God anywhere too. Same thing for camaraderie or fellowship. Oftentimes in our workplaces, we have more of a camaraderie there than we would in our church service. But the point is, there's something to be said about the physical experience of coming together like this and worshiping God together and gathering around us. There's just something special about it. It's not the same. And this is what David is saying. He's saying, I sense a real presence in the worshiping of God, and I want to be in that presence. I desire that more than anything. And is that what we look towards? Is that something that we're desiring more than anything? Too often for us, especially as we live in this age of grace where we don't have any set rules and so forth of what we have to do, we look at much of what we do as being optional. That includes going to church. That includes partaking of the Lord's table. because it's all of grace. And so we think that so much is optional. But for David, he had this deep longing. I want to be in the presence of God. And then he goes on to say that I may gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to behold the beauty of the Lord. It's interesting when we talk about the beauty of the Lord, especially when we look at it in the context of the New Testament. Because I don't know really how beautiful Jesus was. To read the description of the scriptures about Jesus, he was comely. In other words, he was not, and all the pictures show Jesus as handsome, dark-skinned, dark-haired guy, and buff and strong and what every man wants to be and what every woman wants her man to be, this kind of thing. But probably wasn't that way. And after Jesus went through the trauma of the crucifixion, I promise you, he was no one to look on. And he's the only one who bears the scars in heaven. He will have the scars of crucifixion throughout eternity as a testimony of the payment he made for our sin. A story was told about many years ago. A bunch of girls got on a trolley car. As they were riding along in the trolley came to a stop, and a woman with a very heavy veil over her face boarded the car. And as she was getting on board, the wind blew the veil aside for just a moment, and one could see that she had a terribly, horribly ugly face that had been scarred by fire and flame. It had a purplish color to it, and it was just all terribly disformed and disfigured. It looked horrible, so that when one of the girls saw the face, she just stepped back in a fright and said, "Oh, look at that." Ah. And one of her friends, who turned around and saw the same picture of this grotesque face, she wheeled back around to that girl and said to her, "How dare you speak of my mother as being ugly? Her face is the most beautiful face that I've seen." The girl said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know it was your mother." The girl said, "Yes, it is. Her face is the most beautiful thing to me because as I was a little girl, our house caught on fire. And my mother fought her way through the fire and the flames to wrap me in the blankets and to bring me through that fire. When she got outside, she fell down horribly, grotesquely burned, but I was safe and not a mark on me." She said, "And whenever I look upon her face, I think what a beautiful mother she is." As I think of David as he speaks about gazing on the beauty of the Lord, the beauty of God is in his grace, in his love, in his mercy. That's what we should see as the beauty. The fact that he took our place, walked to that cross. And here's David 1,000 years before the cross, not understanding what he's saying, but yet seeing the beauty of what God has done that we might be saved. Yes, it works. Walking the path that God has given to us, it works. Gives us a big sense of confidence. But then there's this loss. And so we come to this second part where he seems to be saying, remind me again. He faces a great lack of confidence here. We all go through times like this. But what the writer is seeking for is what every child looks for. One of the favorite verses that many people look at is Psalm 27, verse 10. He says, "My father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in." And isn't it the desire of every child to find that confidence in their parents? Why, it's in their parents that they would say, "Hear me." I mean, you know what it's like, parents, don't you? You got these little kids and chatter, 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 go on and on and on and on. Most of the time, you don't pay much attention to them. They're just kind of chattering away. But they want to be heard. Sometimes we'll give the occasional, yeah. But children want to be heard. And so it should be with our Heavenly Father. One of the problems that I have in much of religion is this abstract talk about God. My question is He listening? And for most people, if you ask them this question, does your God hear you? Is your God listening to you? Most people would have difficulty answering that question with any kind of certainty at all. We're told in the Scriptures that our prayer requests, in fact, in the Psalms it says it goes right into God's ear. We as parents may be bothered by the constant chatter of children, but God is never too busy to listen. Never too busy to listen. And so the psalmist says, hear me. He also says, lead me. And don't children need guidance? Don't they need directions until they become teenagers and then they want to give you directions, tell you how to do it? But still there's that need. They need to know, they need to understand that mom and dad have walked a little bit farther down the path, and they would be wise to learn from them. They would be wise to not make the same mistakes. I constantly tell my children, I used to constantly tell my children, now I can start telling the grandkids, hey, I am not the example. I mean, I am. I understand that. But there's one that's higher than me. So that if you're watching me, I promise you, I'll fail you. But I want to point you to Jesus. You follow him. That's what Paul said. That's what Paul said. And we need to be careful as parents. Yes, you follow me as I follow Jesus. We need to be careful that we don't set up ourselves as being the perfect example. Lead me. David asks for a path to follow. And God says to him, here, follow this plain path. He asks for divine guidance and a plain path. Now, why would he do that? If you have divine guidance, do you need a plain path? However, one of the best ways that God shows us what he wants us to do is to give us a plain path. I oftentimes ask people when they say, well, Pastor, I'm not really sure what to do here. I don't know which way God's leading me. And my question often is, well, what do you want to do? What path looks plain to you? What looks like the road to go? I mean, don't muddy up the waters. Don't get the path all confused. Because oftentimes God's leading us consists in simply making the path plain. We're the ones who confuse it. Having said that, we still need divine guidance, because even on the plainest path, even on the most clearly marked out path, there's still opportunities for danger and temptation that we need God's wisdom and God's guidance. And so he says, protect me. Children need protection from their parents. Even the great warriors, even the strongest of warriors, seek a stronghold, a place of protection. I suggest this, especially for parents, that your home should be a sanctuary. Your home should be a place of protection. Your children should be able to go to your home and know they are safe.